Thank you all for coming down tonight. We are live from Books and Books in Coral Gables, Florida. So a note to our internet audience watching at home. If you're interested in tonight's book, we'll ship it to wherever you are in the U.S. free of charge. Just call the number on your screen. This evening, Books and Books is very happy to welcome Ms. Rebecca Scherm and her new book, Unbecoming. Ms. Scherm received her, by the way, it is Scherm and not Scherm. I usually try to check beforehand, so we're good. She received her MFA from the University of Michigan, where she was also a postgraduate Zell Fellow. This is her first novel. In it, she takes us from small-town USA to the heights and depths of the art scene in New York and Europe. Atmospheric and psychologically nuanced, Unbecoming reinvents the heist plot and takes up the making of a femme fatale, this time from a woman's point of view. Here to tell us more about it, please give a very warm welcome to Ms. Rebecca Scherm. You go.
Hi there. So what I thought I'd do tonight is read part of the first chapter and then talk a little bit about how I came up with the idea for the book, and then maybe we can go from there to ask to any questions that you all have. But thank you so much for coming tonight. This is my first time in Coral Gables, and my husband and I went to the Venetian pool this afternoon and fell in love and drove around and wondered what we would have to do to afford living here and where do we sign. But thank you so much for having me at Books and Books. It's a pleasure to be here. Okay, chapter 1. The first lie Grace had told Hannah was her name. Bonjour, je m'appelle Julie, Grace had said. She'd been in Paris for only a month, and her French was still new and stiff. She'd chosen the name Julie because it was sweet and easy on the French tongue, much more so than Grace was. The best lies were the simplest and made the most sense in the mind and in the mouth. These lies were the easiest to swallow. Jacqueline, the boss, had shown Grace to her work table, abutting Hannah's, and where to store her tools along the center crack, what she could borrow and what she would need to procure herself. Hannah had reached out to cover a jar of picks and pliers. I don't share these, she'd said with a taut smile, like someone forced to apologize. When Grace sat down on her spinning stool a few minutes later, Hannah asked where she was from. Grace was so obviously American. California, Grace said, because most people already had ideas about California. They didn't ask you to explain it to them. Grace hated lying, got no joy from it, and this was how she knew she wasn't pathological. But California satisfied people so easily, even in Paris. Garland, Tennessee, where Grace was really from, was a confusing answer that only led to more questions. Tennessee, Hannah might have started. Elvis? Pequeno? Hillbillies? When Grace had lived in New York, everyone who asked where she was from followed her answer with the same question. What's that like? As if her journey from somewhere as tiny and undistinguished as Garland had required a laborious transformation. As if getting from Garland to New York City had been some kind of pilgrimage to the first world. Grace had been in Paris for 2 years now, and she had been Julie from California since her arrival. Her life was conducted entirely in French, another kind of disguise. She and Hannah seldom discussed anything deep in the past, and when the conversation took an unwelcome turn, they quickly righted themselves. Facing each other across their tables, they hunched over their antiques and talked of busted hinges and gouged veneer, not sorrow or worry, not home. The boys would be paroled tomorrow, released from Lacombe and sent home to Garland with their families. It was 3 o'clock in Paris now, morning in Tennessee. Riley and Alls would be eating their last breakfast of powdered eggs and sausage patties, doughy-faced guards planted behind them. Grace had always imagined them together, but she'd begun to imagine their lives without her so long ago that she often forgot how little she really knew. She didn't know a thing about their lives anymore. She hadn't spoken to them in more than 3 years, since before they were arrested for robbing the Wynn House. 3 years of imagined sausage breakfasts. He wouldn't come for her, she told herself. It had been too long. Grace had often felt like two people, always at odds. But when the boys had gone to prison, one Grace had stopped her life's clock. Now it had begun to tick again. She had no control of Riley now, what he would do, where he would go, and these unknowns bred in her a private, shapeless dread. She'd left lies unleashed in Garland, and now she couldn't mind them. Riley and Alls were 20 years old when they were sentenced to 8 years each in Lacombe. This was the minimum. It was their first offense. They were unarmed. And, more important to Judge Meyer, they were not your typical criminals. Riley's family was a nice family. The Grahams had lived in Garland for 7 generations, and Alls benefited from the association, as had Grace when she'd been associated. Grace often thought that if Alls alone had been charged with the crime, he would not have gotten off as easy, and that if only Riley had been charged, he probably would have gotten off altogether. Greg had pled guilty too, but his parents had won him a plea bargain for turning in his friends. He was released in a year. Grace had robbed the Wynn house too, and she could not go home again. She remembered the moment, maybe it had lasted minutes or maybe days, after the judge had handed down the 8-year sentence, but before she'd learned that they could be paroled in only 3. 8 years had seemed an incredible length of time. 8 years was longer than she'd known Riley. 8 years seemed long enough for everyone to forget. She gave the birdcage's latch a final swipe with the chamois and called for Jacqueline. The filigree onion dome alone had taken her 9 days to clean. The wire metalwork was so fine that from a distance it might have been human hair. On the first day, she'd held the vacuum hose in her left hand and the hairdryer in her right, blowing off dust and sucking it up before it could land again. Then she'd spent more than a week swabbing the curlicues with dental tools wrapped in cotton and paintbrushes dipped in mineral spirits. This morning, she'd finished scraping off centuries of songbird guano from the cage's floor. It wasn't a bird cage anymore, but a gilded aviary, Orientaliste, late 19th century, nearly as tall as Grace was. Jacqueline would return it to the dealer who had purchased it from the flea market, and he would sell it for at least $5,000, maybe much more. Perhaps it would be wired for electricity and made into a chandelier. Maybe an orchid collector would use it to shield his best specimens from human hovering. Grace had met Riley when she was in 6th grade, just turned 12. He was a year older. At her first middle school dance,
I missed that. I'm so sorry.
it's okay. At her first middle school dance, he had plucked her from a gaggle of girls she wanted badly to impress, and she and Riley had swayed, arm's length apart, to the ballad over the loudspeaker. He'd invited her to his house for dinner, where Mrs. Graham had gently chatted to Grace about school while her husband and 4 sons stripped 3 roast chickens in 10 minutes. Riley, the youngest, was the worst, lunging for the last of the potatoes while Grace was still figuring out how to cut her chicken breast with her fork and not make so much noise against the plate. Mrs. Graham reached to still Riley's hand and suggested he save seconds for his friend before he helped himself to thirds. "Some chivalry, please," she had said. Grace had read that word in books, but she'd never heard anyone say it out loud. And Grace tried not to stare at her, but Mrs. Graham pulled at her attention whenever she looked away. Mrs. Graham was thin and tan and freckled, with sleepy green eyes that turned down slightly at the outside. She had a slow blink. Grace thought she could feel it herself, as though a light had briefly dimmed. Grace admired the light shimmer on her high cheekbones, her sea glass earrings, her low, tender voice. Her fingers were long and delicate, nails polished with a milky, translucent pink, knuckles unfairly swollen from arthritis. That Grace's own nails were bitten to the quick had never bothered her until now. At the end of the week, Riley had kissed her in the school hallway between bells, so quickly that she wondered later if she had imagined it. Within a month, he had bought her a necklace, a gold dolphin on a thin chain, and pledged his love. She felt as if she were in the movies. What she wouldn't give to see herself and Riley like that, from above. To watch a flickering reel of Riley, his hair still victory red, it hadn't yet begun to fade, pulling her toward him on the sweaty, squeaking floor of the gym. Had she been scared, excited, smug? She'd been just a child, and then she entered a we, an usness. She and Riley seemed cute to his parents and their teachers, something from our gang. But Riley had 3 older brothers, and the precocity that came with them. And Grace had no one else. Tomorrow, Riley and Alls would be released. She felt as if she had been standing in a road at night, watching a car's distant headlights approaching so slowly that she had forever to step out of the way. But now that car was upon her, and still she had not moved. She imagined what tomorrow would look like. Riley's parents, or maybe just his father, going to pick him up at the prison. Dr. Graham would bring him a change of clothes. Riley had worn a 32. Did he still? He would look different. He would be paler, less freckled from the lack of sun, and he would be older, of course. 23. She kept thinking of them as boys, but they weren't boys anymore. Dr. Graham would bring Riley's old clothes, a pair of worn khakis, one of his paint-stained button-downs with holes in the elbows. Here, the bundle of clothes would say, this is who you were and will be again. And Grace imagined Riley riding home in the passenger seat of the Graham's ancient blue Mercedes wagon, the diesel loud enough to bring the neighbors to the windows. Everyone would know that today was the day. And Mrs. Graham would have made barbecue, a pork shoulder, and Riley's brothers would be there. Grace didn't know if all three lived in Garland, but they probably did. The Grahams belonged to Garland as much as Garland belonged to them. And she imagined Riley excusing himself from the cookout and going inside to sit on his bed in his old bedroom, which would be his room again, at least for a while. And she wondered if he would go upstairs, to the attic bedroom that Mrs. Graham had made up for Grace for when she stayed over. And where would Alls go tomorrow? Did his father still live in Garland? He would have no welcome home party. She imagined Alls and his dad driving through the Burger King on the way home. Unless he went home with Riley. He would have before, but that meant nothing. The line between before and after couldn't be sharper. When people read about the Wynn robbery as a footnote in a national newspaper, Small Town Folly picked up on the wire, they'd probably laughed or shaken their heads. Listen to this one, millions of people would have said over the breakfast table. But those stupid boys had been Grace's. She used to think that she knew Riley so well she could peel off his skin and slip it over hers and no one would ever be the wiser. They had gone to prison because of her, really. Grace longed to tell someone what she had done. She'd never had friends, just Riley. Now Hannah. Grace could only have one friend at a time. Any more and it became harder to keep track of how they knew her, what she had told them, which pieces went where. She had not been in Garland the day of the Wynn robbery. She was already in Prague then, at a summer study abroad program. Riley had paid for her tuition, her ticket. Grace didn't have that kind of money. She had read of the robbery online the night that it happened, on the homepage of the Albemarle Records website. A young white male had entered the main house of the Josephus Wynn Historic Estate in Garland, Tennessee, on Tuesday, June 2nd, between 8 and 10 in the morning, and locked the docent in an upstairs bedroom. The groundskeeper was found unconscious in the foyer. He was at Albemarle Hospital in critical condition. And she had not heard from Riley since the day before, but she knew he had done it. 4 days later, he, Alls, and Greg were arrested in Tennessee. Greg was first, alone at his parents' cabin on Norris Lake. Hours later, Alls and Riley were arrested at the boys' rental house on Orange Street, where Grace had also lived, until she went to Prague at the end of May. She was sure that Greg had turned them in. She received just one call from the police, after the arrest. The front desk matron sent her son, a dull-eyed boy of about 11, to knock on the door of Grace's shared dorm room. She followed him downstairs, her heart beating so heavily that her chest cramped. The American detective asked if she knew why he was calling. She said she did. He asked her to tell him. She said that her boyfriend had been accused of robbing the Wynn house. "You mean your husband?" he said. Yes. She and Riley had never told anyone that they had married. He asked when she had last communicated with him. "A few days ago," she said, 5 days. "He emailed me, very normal, nothing strange. He said he was going to his friend's house on Morris Lake. He couldn't have robbed the Wynn house." "And how did you find out about the robbery?" "I read it in the paper," she said, "online." "You're reading the local paper while you're in Prague?" "I've been homesick." "And you didn't talk to your husband at all after you heard about the robbery?" She had not. She told the detective that she knew Riley wouldn't email her from the lake. They always started drinking before they unhitched the boat, and they only dried out when it was time to drive home. Grace herself had just taken a trip to Kutna Hora, to the Bone Church underground, where the bones of 50,000 people had been strung into altars and chandeliers by a half-blind monk. Those bones belonged to victims of the Black Death and the Hussite Wars. That some idiot had stolen Josephus Wynn's old silverware didn't seem very important, she told the detective. She shut up. Too much. He asked her half a dozen more questions, but they weren't difficult ones. Grace told him that he'd made a mistake, that Riley could not have done that. He has such a good life, she said. We're happy. He doesn't need money. His parents help him. And besides, she said, I would have known. He couldn't have kept anything like that from me. He tells me everything. Everything. Perhaps the detective was a man whose own wife believed that he told her everything. What the detective did not tell Grace, what she learned days later in the news, was that Riley Alzengregg had already confessed. The detective was just crossing off his to-do list. He'd needed nothing from her. This was how she imagined the robbery. Riley slipping a sweaty $5 bill into the recommended donation box and smiling at the tiny old docent on duty, following her through the downstairs rooms as she recited footnotes of Tennessee history. Riley had been through the house half a dozen times over the years. They all had. The Wynn House was the closest, cheapest school field trip. But on a summer Tuesday, the place was dead. He stopped hearing the docent's voice clearly, as though he were underwater, and he followed her upstairs. Her legs, 90, blue and veiny in her whitish stockings, shook less than his did. At the top of the stairs, she turned back and moved her mouth, looked at him expectantly. A question? She had asked him a question. Yeah, he said. Yes, ma'am. He hoped it was the right answer. He followed her from room to room, nodding and scrawling gibberish in his notebook. Outside the door to the tiny windowless study, he rolled his notebook up and stuck it in his pen in his baggy front pocket. She opened the door outward, he followed her inside, and he pointed with a trembling finger at the tiny print over the toilet table. Can you tell me who the artist is who made that? That one? I don't remember. Let me get a better look. She stepped forward and peered at the signature, which he already knew to be indecipherable. He held his breath and tried to back quietly out of the room. The edge of the rug caught under his heel and he stumbled. She turned around. Are you all right, hon? He jerked his foot free and made for the door, slamming it behind him. He grabbed the ladder-back chair that sat next to the door and wedged the top rung under the knob. He breathed. Now that she was safely pinned, he could hear her voice leaking under the door. Not screaming, asking. She was asking again, something. He didn't know what, just the sensation of her tinny voice from far away, like a house cat trapped in a basement. He went downstairs and opened the front door. Alzengregg came in quietly with scrunched-up nylon grocery bags and 3 pairs of gloves. They dispersed into the rooms, filling their bags with needlework samplers, old desk clocks, a silver-hilted hunting knife. They had carefully made this list of treasures. Nothing large or cumbersome. Nothing one of a kind. They did not expect the front door to open. A man they had never seen before stepped in with a garbage bag to empty the small wastebasket by the door. He was the groundskeeper, and he always came on Mondays, never Tuesdays. But here he was, seeing them. The groundskeeper, who was past 70, fell to the floor. The boys grabbed the bags they had filled and fled. I'm going to stop there. So I thought I would tell you, before we ask questions, a little bit about how I came to this novel, what it's about, and sort of where I got the ideas for it. You could say that it's a heist novel because it's about a failed heist as a way of understanding these people's lives and everything that comes after the heist. And you could also say that it's a love story, but it's really sort of 3 different love stories. And both as the writer and I think as the reader, I was struggling, and I expect the reader to also struggle with which of these love stories is real, or which of them really means something permanent or something true. So it's about this young woman who starts off as a young girl who's very tragically anxious to please, and how she grows up into someone we might call a femme fatale. And I had this idea because in my childhood I read a lot of noir fiction, Dashiell Hammett, and I got used to this idea of the femme fatale as a type. I sort of grew up encountering her. But the femme fatale always passes through the plot as a plot point. She's there to explain what happened. And she's only the femme fatale because the hero says she's the femme fatale, right? She's there to be a trap. So when I got older, I started thinking about what the femme fatale would be like in her own book, what her life would really be like, how she got to be that way, sort of how the leopard got his spot, sort of a problem, and the full psychological weight of all of the decisions that led to these crimes that would make her called the femme fatale. And I decided that I would write a book trying to sort of untangle that knot. The other idea that sort of collided with this idea was about Grace Kelly. Because when I was a little girl, I was a little obsessed with Grace Kelly, and especially in her Alfred Hitchcock movies. And I think my mother and my grandmother really encouraged this obsession. And as a little girl, I would watch Grace Kelly on the screen and be totally captivated by her. And I didn't really understand that she couldn't be real. I knew that she was acting. I knew that she was an actress, and she never disappeared into her roles. There's nothing realistic or natural about Grace Kelly as an actress. She's performing the role of Grace Kelly. But this had something to do with feminine performance for me when I was a little girl, like how I thought that women should be, or if I tried hard enough, how I thought that I could be if I grew up with perfect manners and perfect hair or something. And then I got older and realized I was never going to be Grace Kelly. That was not in the cards. And somehow, before I started writing this novel, the idea about Grace Kelly is this perfect feminine ideal that's impossible and in many ways not desirable to really be. Oh. And the femme fatale is this other type who's sort of the opposite, kind of collided together. And I started to ask myself, what if they're the same woman? What if they're the same really complicated woman? And it's my job to figure out how she got that way. And that's how I started writing this book. The heists, the jewelry, the antiques, all of that came later. But it started with this idea of this one woman who became the character of Grace. So yeah. Can I answer any questions for you all?
I can answer one for you. I know how you can move to Coral Gables.
Tell me how.
You can be an audiobook person.
Oh, thank you.
Captivated me. I have not read this book. I'm here just because it happened. You just happened to be here.
Well, thank you.
And you read very well.
Oh, that's a lovely compliment. Thank you very much.
Reading out loud is a gift.
Okay, I'm going to move to Coral Gables and become a voice actress, and I'll see you all next year.
But this book an audiobook.
This is an audiobook.
It is?
Yes.
But not read by you?
Not read by me. The actress is Catherine Tabor, and she has a lovely voice, and she sounds exactly like I think Grace's voice would sound. And they let me listen to the tapes of the actresses that they were thinking about, and I had always imagined the voice sounding, well, frankly, I think I'd always imagined it sounding like I was reading it 30 years from now. Like me 30 years older is what it would sound like or something. Something gravelly with a lot of earned authority. But the actress they chose sounds like the main character. She's a very seductive voice. I could listen to her read anything. Yeah.
You were imagining a Lauren Bacall voice.
Yes, I was. Yeah. Probably exactly.
It's interesting that the book has these sort of genre fiction elements without being genre fiction. It's literary fiction. And this makes me curious about your previous stories. Did they also have any genre elements to them, or is this your first foray into something like that?
I'm so happy that you put it that way, because that's exactly how I see it. No, my short fiction I don't think has any of those genre elements. And I think the problem, and I mean problem in a good way, problem in the way that you encounter a puzzle that you want to untangle, is for me as a writer, I'm always pushing up against something that I want to solve, some puzzle that I want to solve. And in some ways, it was this character that I wanted to solve. But in other ways, it was my love for certain genres, for noir, for caper novels, for heist novels. Right. I was talking to them and trying to understand why I loved them. A funny story about that goes back to the Grace Kelly thing. I watched To Catch a Thief probably 100 times between at the ages of 10 and 13. And this was after I'd exhausted Rear Window, which you can do if you watch it enough times, in the way that children can watch things over and over and over again. But I watched To Catch a Thief so many times. It's not a great movie. It's a beautiful movie. The surfaces are extraordinary. It's like a beautiful wedding cake or something. But I wonder now if I was watching it, trying to imbue it with some substance that it didn't have, like trying to fill in all of this story. And the reason that I think I might have been doing that is because I totally misremembered it in my mind. I mangled the ending utterly. And when I set out to write this book, I thought I was writing something that had something to do with To Catch a Thief. Because what I thought happened at the end was that Francie, Grace Kelly character, and Roby, the Cary Grant character, ran off and became jewel thieves together. Now, this movie came out in 1955, so I'm going to spoil it for you. That is not what happens at the end of the movie. They settle down and become law-abiding citizens in the south of France, and then the mother-in-law moves in. It's not at all what I thought. So I wrote this book, and I think like in the third draft, I finally rewatched To Catch a Thief. And I was really embarrassed because I'd been talking about it like with friends and colleagues for years. I mean, I think I had even talked about it with my editor, and then I watched the movie and realized I wrote the movie in my mind the way I wanted it to be. And I think that's because even at that very young age, I was talking to these genres or pushing up against the heist film or the stylish caper film and trying to solve something about it. Yeah, and I mean, it's the same sort of reason that I think I wrote a heist novel in the first place, because I would be so interested in heists in the newspaper. Whenever I encountered them, I would follow them. I would just gravitate toward them like a moth to the flame. And I realized at some point that I was reading heist stories in the news as if I were watching a movie. I didn't really believe that it was real crime anymore. I was so in love with the narrative of it. And I would forgive the criminals in this way that I would not find myself doing with other crime, you know. But when the gang broke into Harry Winston in Paris in disguises and made off with all the diamonds, I loved it. And I wanted them to get away. So it became a problem of trying to understand what it was I liked about this. Like, well, why don't you dare yourself to write a heist and see what it would really be like? In the same way that you need to investigate the dark underbelly of To Catch a Thief, why don't you force yourself to investigate the psychological underbelly of all these glamorous heists that are not at all glamorous in real life? So yeah.
It's also, the post-heist period of a crime or something, or when if things start to unravel, that's very fertile ground.
Yeah. And we don't see a lot of that. I mean, there are a few key films that are about that fertile ground.
Reservoir Dogs.
Right. Reservoir Dogs. But I wanted to look
You
at...
don't even see the crime in Reservoir Dogs. It's only all the aftermath.
Right. And I think I was wanting to know, even that aftermath was not enough for me. I want to see the whole picture. I want to see how someone became the person who makes this decision and all the decisions afterward. And so then you really have to trace the dot back to its very beginnings, you know. I think the earliest memories in the book are Grace's, they're just brief. Most of the book takes place sort of between 18 and 25. But there are memories when she's 8 years old and she steals something for the first time, right? And so everybody I know has some memory of stealing something as a child, right? And they either think it's funny or they're haunted by it, right? It's one or the other, depending on how you dealt with it afterward or whom you feel like you hurt. But I knew that for her, the first time that she stole something would be really important, would be really loaded, yeah.
Also on the topic of genre, I've seen your book described as an unbecoming of age story. Genre, to the best of my knowledge, does not exist.
Yeah.
I'm hoping you can comment on what you think such a genre would be and how what you're doing fits into it and what it might accomplish.
Yeah, a lot of that has to do with the way female characters are often written in fiction that I would expect, if I were reading a book like mine and I had not read it, I would expect the heroine to repent at the end. I would expect a redemption narrative. And I think that we're trained as readers and as watchers of movies to expect that certain kind of ending. That's what a coming-of-age story is, right? Someone matures, becomes responsible or self-aware or becomes better, right? Well, what if in a coming-of-age story we see someone unraveling or someone becoming someone that they shouldn't become, right? Then it's not just about sort of the identity of unbecoming. It's also about unbecoming behavior. And, the title is, I love double entendre. That's what's going on there. It's sort of about bad behavior that's allowed to happen in the universe of the book. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but it doesn't end in the Girl Scouts. Yeah. Yeah. And I don't think we see enough of that in fiction with female characters. I think we need more bad female characters who are complicated and real. Not necessarily sociopaths or murderers, but people who just screw up. We all know people who are just screwing up all the time, and I like to read about them and write about them. Yeah.
So your previous fiction didn't have genre elements, but let's say, did it have genre devices like the slow revealing of because I'm reminded,
Yeah.
have you read a novel called Rise and Fall of Great Powers by Tom Rockman?
Oh, no. Is that Tom Rockman's newer book?
That's right.
I haven't read it yet. No.
It's interesting because it also is not, it's not genre fiction, and yet it uses the genre device of slowly drawing out the mystery of the main character's life.
I've been practicing doing that.
Yeah. Genre techniques rather than genre content.
Yeah, and that's really well put too. Yes, I think that I have been practicing, doing genre practices, genre techniques for a very long time. And I think that for me that's because the form of the novel is as interesting to me as the content of the novel. And I don't necessarily mean in a necessarily experimental way. I mean, what can a novel do to a story in the way that we receive a story that other forms cannot do? It can drop little clues and then lead us right over them. It can tell us things and have us not notice them. Mary Gateskill, I always come back to this. Mary Gateskill said in a talk at the Center for Fiction several years ago when I was first starting this book that writing fiction was important to her because it was the closest you could get to inhabiting another person's brain. And I would always say to my students now, writing fiction or reading fiction is like zipping on someone else's human suit. It's the closest you can get to being someone else. And to me, that's something that only fiction can do. In a movie, you never forget that you're watching characters, right? You never get confused and think that you are the character. But in a novel, it's dangerous. We feel often dangerous because we get collapsed with the characters and we feel like we're doing the bad things that they're doing, and we can't help it. We're stuck with them. We're along. We're bound together. And so I would say that's one device of novel. Let's just call novel the genre that I fell in love with from a very young age. And those other more genre devices, putting people in a very tight space and watching them lose their minds, love triangles. Those are things that I really enjoy playing with to get at the truth, right? Ways to navigate toward truth. Yeah.
And then writers always say that they conceive the character and then the characters start to behave on their own.
Writing this book was often very difficult emotionally because Grace, the character, would be so hard on me. She's not an easy, cuddly person to spend all that time with. I'm spending time with someone dangerous, with someone who's a liar. The first line is that she's a liar. And sometimes she would be so beyond my control And the decisions that she would make were so beyond any decision that I would make. And she'd be just beyond my reach, and I would be thinking, how can you do this? How can you do this? And those times were really hard. I would have to leave the house. I remember distinctly being in the sort of darkest time of writing this book during lilac season in Michigan, which was very lucky, because what I would do is when I got into a really dark place, I would just leave the house and I would go around and like snort the neighbor's lilacs like a crazy woman. Just like walk around the block until I felt, okay, I'm a real person in the world. I'm not in this book. I am safe, you know, and then I would go back and look at her across the table again. Yeah.
How long did it take you to write this book?
About 3.5 years, all told. Yeah. Mhm. I was doing other things during that time, but this was the most important thing. Yeah.
What made you, besides the fact that you were like kind of challenged with the fact that Grace made some decisions that you would never do, what kept you going to make those strong decisions?
I needed to understand her. I mean, I created this person who was so impenetrable to me. She's just nothing like me. And that knot of trying to understand someone who you are worried you're never going to be able to comprehend. I mean, we all have people this in our real lives. I'll never understand her, or I'll never understand him. Well, it turns out that's a 3.5-year project. If you really devote yourself to understanding someone, I think maybe you can do it in 3.5 years. But that was when I knew that the book was finished. When I got to this moment at the very, very end of the book, where I thought, oh, that's it. That's the deepest piece of her core. And I had to go back and then rewrite the book again, because now I had this new piece of information. And that doesn't mean you're going to tell it, you know, but everything looks different once you have that new piece of information. I mean, think about it in real life. You learn a secret that someone has, everything looks different, right? And writing a novel is the same way. You get these secrets, and you just have to keep opening your eyes wider, blinking, kind of, okay. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Okay. Thank you all so much for coming. I'll be over here signing books and can talk to you about anything else.
Sure. If there are no more questions, then a reminder for our internet audience at home. There's still time for you to call the store, and we can ship the book to wherever you are in the U.S. free of charge. For those of you here in the house, Unbecoming is for sale at the counter over there in the front room, as well as the audio version, which is not going to be as good as Rebecca's voice. She'll be signing over here at the table to the left of the podium, and this has been such a lovely event. Let's please give Rebecca another hand. Thank you very much. Very good.